The United States is grappling with a web of interconnected structural challenges that threaten its economic, social, and political stability. Key issues include widening income inequality, an outdated and inequitable education system, deteriorating infrastructure, political polarization, and shifting global power dynamics. These challenges are not isolated, rather, they reinforce one another, creating a complex environment that requires urgent and coordinated solutions. Each of these issues contributes to the growing divide between affluent and impoverished communities, further straining the nation's social fabric. Below is a comprehensive analysis of these challenges, supported by recent data and statistics, to illustrate the magnitude and urgency of the problems facing the United States. Widening income inequality and wealth disparity. Income inequality in the United States has reached alarming levels, with the top 1% of earners holding approximately 32% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 50% hold just 2%. This wealth gap has doubled since the 1980s, and the disparity continues to grow. According to the Federal Reserve, as of 2023, the wealthiest 10% of Americans control nearly 70% of the nation's total wealth. This extreme concentration of wealth at the top reduces economic mobility for the rest of the population, making it increasingly difficult for lower-income individuals to improve their socioeconomic standing. The impact of this inequality is multifaceted. A 2022 study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, found that the United States ranks last among G7 nations in terms of income mobility, with children born into low-income families in the US having only a 7.5% chance of reaching the top 20% of income earners. This lack of upward mobility creates a feedback loop where wealth and opportunity are concentrated within a small segment of the population, leaving many Americans behind. Furthermore, income inequality fosters social tensions and political division, as those in the lower income brackets feel increasingly disenfranchised, leading to heightened resentment and mistrust in institutions. Skill gaps and barriers in education. As technology advances, the US faces a significant skills gap, particularly in high-demand sectors such as technology, engineering, and healthcare. According to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, there are currently around 10 million job openings, with a large portion of these vacancies in specialized fields that require advanced skills. However, many Americans lack access to the necessary training to fill these positions, largely due to the rising costs of education. As of 2024, the average student loan debt for graduates is approximately $37,500, with total student debt surpassing $1.7 trillion. This debt burden discourages many from pursuing higher education or advanced training, limiting their access to high-paying jobs. The inability to afford higher education disproportionately impacts low-income families and exacerbates existing inequalities. Research from Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce indicates that students from high-income families are more than twice as likely to obtain a college degree compared to students from low-income backgrounds. The barriers to education not only limit individual opportunities, but also hinder overall economic growth. A lack of skilled workers stifles innovation and productivity, which are essential for maintaining a competitive economy in a globalized world. Bridging the skills gap will require significant cooperation between businesses, educational institutions, and government entities. Some experts advocate for increased investment in vocational training and apprenticeship programs, which can provide practical skills for high-demand fields without the high cost of a traditional college education. However, these programs currently account for only 0.3% of post-secondary enrollment in the US, compared to 7% in countries like Germany and Switzerland, which have robust apprenticeship systems that lead to higher employment rates and lower youth unemployment. Crumbling infrastructure and economic impact. The American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, has consistently graded US infrastructure poorly, assigning it a C- in its 2021 infrastructure report card. The report estimated that the US would need to invest $2.6 trillion over the next decade to bring infrastructure to an acceptable standard. Roads, bridges, airports, and water systems are deteriorating, and the cost of inaction is growing. According to the ASCE, The US economy loses approximately $1 trillion every year due to infrastructure deficiencies, which translates to lost productivity, increased transportation costs, and inefficiencies. For instance, the US has over 45,000 bridges that are classified as structurally deficient, and nearly 1 in 3 US roads are in poor condition. As these systems continue to degrade, they hamper economic growth, reduce productivity, and threaten public safety. Delays in infrastructure investment only compound the problem, as repair costs rise exponentially as systems deteriorate further. The ASCE estimates that by 2039, infrastructure deficiencies could cost American households $3,300 annually, with business losses reaching $7 trillion. The debate over how to fund infrastructure improvements, however, has led to a political deadlock. Proposals for increased taxation or borrowing to finance large-scale projects face opposition, delaying much-needed investment. While the bipartisan infrastructure bill passed in 2021 allocated $1.2 trillion to infrastructure over the coming years, experts argue that it falls short of what is needed to address the full scale of the problem. Each delay further erodes the US's competitive edge as other nations such as China invest heavily in modern infrastructure. Stagnant productivity growth and economic consequences. The US has experienced slower productivity growth over the past few decades, which threatens long-term economic success. Between 1995 and 2004, productivity grew by an average of 3% annually, but since 2010 it has stagnated at around 1%. This slowdown hinders wage growth and limits the economy's ability to expand. Economists link this decline to a range of factors, including insufficient investments in technology and research and development, R&D, as well as the skills gap that limits workforce efficiency. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, increasing R&D investment is essential to reversing this trend. Currently, the US spends about 2.7% of its GDP on R&D, trailing behind countries like South Korea and Germany, which invest 4.5% and 3% of their GDP, respectively. Addressing this stagnation will require targeted policies that encourage innovation, support workforce development, and adapt to modern economic realities. If left unaddressed, stagnant productivity could contribute to a prolonged period of economic stagnation, reducing the US's global influence. Political polarization and its impact on reform. Political polarization in the US has reached unprecedented levels, making it extremely difficult to implement long-term reforms. A 2023 survey by the Pew Research Center found that 85% of Republicans and 81% of Democrats viewed the other party as a threat to the country's well-being. This deep divide has led to gridlock on major issues, with states often split along red and blue lines that influence policies on healthcare, climate change, taxation, and education. This legislative gridlock has significant consequences, as it prevents the country from addressing structural issues that require bipartisan cooperation. For example, healthcare reform, which has the potential to alleviate financial stress for millions of Americans, remains in limbo as parties clash over ideological differences. The inability to pass comprehensive policies that benefit society as a whole creates an environment where pressing issues remain unaddressed, further deepening distrust in government and democracy. Shifting global power dynamics and strategic challenges. The US has long been strategically positioned due to its geographic isolation, but shifting global power dynamics, particularly with the rise of China and India, are challenging America's influence. China's GDP is projected to surpass that of the US within the next decade, while India has emerged as one of the fastest growing economies in the world. These changes, especially within the Yuxi Circle, home to more than half of the world's population, are tilting global economic and political power toward Asia. This shift has implications for US national security and economic policy. The US is now confronted with the challenge of competing with economically powerful nations that are increasingly setting the standards for global trade, technology, and policy. Meanwhile, ongoing immigration challenges at the US southern border reflect regional instability, which places additional stress on domestic resources and exacerbates social divides. The costs of a vast military presence abroad, with over 800 military bases worldwide, The US maintains a significant international military presence, consuming approximately $900 billion annually. This accounts for nearly 40% of global military spending, a figure that is staggering when compared to domestic needs. While this global network supports US geopolitical interests, it comes at the expense of investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure that could improve the quality of life for American citizens. As more citizens feel the burden of taxes without corresponding improvements in their daily lives, frustration grows. A study by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs found that the costs of post-9/11 wars alone exceeded $8 trillion, underscoring the trade-offs between military spending and domestic needs. This financial burden not only impacts public sentiment, but also limits the government's ability to address pressing social issues. Education. Inequality. The impact of local funding. The American education system is highly stratified, with public school funding based largely on local property taxes, resulting in stark disparities between wealthy and poor districts. According to a report from the National Center for Education Statistics, schools in the wealthiest districts spend an average of $12,000 more per student annually than those in the poorest districts. This inequality in funding perpetuates cycles of disadvantage, as students in underfunded schools have fewer resources, lower quality teachers, and fewer opportunities for advancement. The impact of this inequality is felt most acutely by minority and low-income communities, as residential segregation has concentrated poverty in certain areas. A recent study from Stanford University found that Black and Hispanic students are more likely to attend underfunded schools, perpetuating educational disparities that contribute to income inequality. Without addressing these disparities, the US risks limiting economic opportunity for entire generations, further entrenching poverty. The influence of money in politics. The outsized influence of money in politics undermines democratic representation, as wealthy individuals and corporations wield disproportionate power over policy decisions. Data from Open Secrets reveals that political spending by the top 1% of donors accounted for over 40% of all campaign contributions in the 2022 midterm elections. This concentration of political influence creates policies that often favor the wealthy, fueling public distrust and disengagement from the political process. Reverse migration and the global talent shift. As developing countries improve living standards and job opportunities, an increasing number of skilled immigrants in the US are choosing to return to their home countries. This trend, known as reverse migration, poses a threat to the US, which has historically benefited from attracting global talent. A 2023 survey by the Migration Policy Institute shows that nearly 20% of STEM-educated immigrants are considering returning to their home countries within the next 5 years, citing better opportunities and quality of life abroad. A call for coordinated reform. Addressing these interconnected challenges requires coordinated reform that prioritizes economic equity, education, and infrastructure, while balancing domestic and international interests. Without substantial change, these structural issues will continue to exacerbate one another, creating a cycle that limits social mobility, economic growth, and global competitiveness. By investing in education, modernizing infrastructure, and fostering bipartisan cooperation, the US can lay a foundation for a more prosperous and equitable future.